Hi everyone, it's Laura here for Studio Katia, and in today's video I'm going to share with you how to create an easy watercolor background using Distress Ink refuse. I started by creating my background, and for that I die cut some watercolor cardstock by Crafter's Companion using the Scallop Hearts cover die by Studio Katia. I then sprayed the entire surface with clean water using my distress sprayer. You could also wet it with a paintbrush, and then I'm going to use my distress ink reinkers to add some color to my background. As you can see, the cardstock is warping because I haven't taped it down to my glass mat or to any hard surface, but we are going to fix it later on. At this point, I'm just dropping a few drops of my Distress Ink reinkers in the colors Tumbled Glass, Cracked Pistachio and Peacock Feathers, and a little goes a long way here because there is a lot of pigment in the refuse, so you don't need a lot to cover the entire panel. I'm also spraying a little bit more water and helping the pigments move around with a paintbrush. And I also pressed the panel against my glass mat, and the fact that there is water underneath is kind of keeping it flat. At this point, the background is basically ready. I am speeding up the drying process using my heat gun. I'm using it on the lower heat setting. This is a dual speed heat gun. And then I decided to add a little bit more texture. And for that, I first used whatever pigments were left on my glass mat. I picked them up with a paintbrush and I created some droplets. I also added a little bit of a distress look by spritzing some clear water on the background. I'm adding a few white splatters with a white acrylic paint, and then I'm also going to add a little bit of sparkle with these Spectrum Noir sparkle inks. This is in the color Jade, so it's tinted and it has some subtle glitter in it. I dried everything once again with my heat tool, and I can see that the background is pretty warped at this point, but we will fix that later on. Now it's time to focus on today's images, and for that I used the Studio Katia Under the Sea stamp set. This is one of my favorite stamp sets by Studio Katia. I think it's super fun and I wanted to create a really cheerful and colorful card today, so I felt this was pretty appropriate for the purpose. I had my stamps laid out on my Misty. I picked them up with the lid of the Misty itself, and then I inked them up with Spectrum Noir alcohol-proof black ink before stamping them on the sheet of Nina Solar White 110 pounds cardstock that I have in my Misty as well. Because I'm using a stamp positioning tool, in case I don't get a perfect impression the first time, I can go ahead and stamp everything twice and I'm going to get precise results every time. For the coloring today, I used my Spectrum Noir Illustrator markers. The coloring of the manta ray didn't get recorded unfortunately, but there I used LV3, HB3, HB2 and HB1. I will have a list of the markers I used in the blog post that you will find linked in the description box down below in case you want to use it as a reference, but basically the idea was to have a rainbow color palette on my card today, so I'm using colors from all color families to color in these fun little fish. So I used some purples for the manta ray, I used some pinks for the jellyfish, and for the squid I'm going to use some oranges. I'm using 3 to 4 markers per color, and I am generally starting with my darkest marker and blending everything out towards the highlights with my mid-tone and highlight markers. Adding shading also creates dimension in the images, and I am mostly keeping the darker markers on the right side of the images and then blending everything out towards the left side of the images. And I'm doing this more or less on every image to keep everything consistent, and this basically translates into having your light source on the top left of the screen. And if thinking about light sources is something that you find confusing or a little bit intimidating, all you need to do is just to pick a side, whether it's the right side of your image or the left side, it really doesn't matter. Add your shadows there and then blend your markers towards the highlights, keeping the highlights in the opposite part of the image, and this will create enough dimension and will bring your images to life. We are almost done with the coloring and we almost covered all the colors in the rainbow. I used some yellows for the smaller fish and these ice blue markers for the coral. So obviously today's coloring is not realistic at all. It's all based on the fact that I wanted a rainbow palette because I really wanted to create a bright, colorful and cheerful card today. The only neutral colors that I used are the ice grays that I used to color the rocks, and then once the coloring was done, I die cut everything with the coordinating dies to the Studio Katia Under the Sea stamp set. On the side of the screen you can see my ocean background and it doesn't look quite as warped as it was, right? And this is because I ran it through my die cutting machine, protecting it with some copy paper, and that reduced the warping by a lot. The next step was to adhere it to my card base, and I created the card base out of some black cardstock that I die cut with the Darling ribbon and dotted frames dies. I added a generous amount of Studio Katia liquid glue on the back of my ocean background and I adhered it on my card base. I added so much glue because I wanted to make sure that that minimal warping that had remained after running the panel through my die cutting machine was completely gone at the end of the card making process. So that's why I went with a little bit more glue than I would normally use. At this point it was time to assemble my scene and I'm basically just scattering all these cute characters around my panel using again Studio Katia liquid glue, reverse tweezers and my embellishment wand for those tiny little images that are still a little bit hard to grab with the tweezers. For the sentiment I used the Lovely Words dies by Studio Katia and I die cut the word hugs from black and white cardstock. I adhered them to each other, slightly shifted so that I created a drop shadow effect, and then I adhered everything to my card front. I added a few finishing touches and I started by adding some glitter with a glitter brush pen by scrapbook.com. I added it only to the smaller images and to the air bubbles. And then I added some highlights with a Sakura number 10 Jelly Roll pen that I also used to create some little dots on the cheeks of the critters. This is something that I do pretty often and that I think makes the images even cuter. With a Sakura glaze pen in the color black, I went over the eyes of the critters as this adds a little bit of shine and dimension, and then I adhered everything to a pre-cut and pre-scored card base. And here is the final result. I love the way the card turned out, the background is really pretty and was super fast and easy to make, and these critters just make me smile. And that's it for today. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment in the comment section down below. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe for more card making and paper crafting inspiration. Thank you all so much for stopping by and have a great day.